sometimes when you're at Google, it's easier to put less on the slide in order to be able to have a more candid conversation, I've discovered. So, and I'm here to have interesting conversations because I think I have some things to say, but I think the conversations with y'all are probably the most interesting part of this. And so for this first question, I think many of you probably in the room have a good idea of what it takes. Or you know, some of you actively work on multimodal routing apps for a variety of different target audiences. And some of this, I say easy, you know, building a routing engine, building a usable application that you can put in for a user. Like, for me, I call that the easy part because it's the part you sort of control yourself. Often the hard part is the data you need to power those applications. And I'm probably not, you know, I think you saw from the presentations this morning, a lot of work goes into generating the data sets we need to build accessible routing applications for, you know, different target audiences, different user groups. And you have a lot of approaches there, you know, whether you depend on a full-blown map data set from an existing data provider, maybe intermediate data sets that you get from third parties, or even trying to generate raw data yourself from imagery and signals. There's a lot of challenges there, there's a lot of trade-offs, and I think we're gonna talk about some of those in this session today. But maybe I can be a little more candid about where does Google get the data to power Google Maps? And this has been a journey for Google over 2 decades now. And the story is probably one you're familiar with, but a lot of it is imagery. Famously, Street View, our program to map the world, to build a map where we drove every street in the world, took pictures of it, and used more human horsepower than algorithmic back in the day to actually build out that map. And these days, we still use combinations of algorithmics and operational-based approaches. But there's a lot of things where we still depend on third-party data from cities and municipalities, from a variety of folks, aggregators. We do a lot with UGC, user-generated content, where feedback from our users tells us where we have issues, where we have problems. And increasingly, a lot of sensor signals from instrumented vehicles, from navigation traces, which are allowing us to more dynamically update the map in direct response to what people are experiencing as they attempt to navigate the world, whether that be in a vehicle, a bus, or even on foot or bike. And so that's our story. And it's an interesting one, but it's not the whole story for mapping. So I'll talk a little bit about some other experiences outside of that, which I think hopefully kind of transcend the space, like which are, you know, what are the main challenges in the 3P mobility space? And again, I think I'm still asking questions that some of you probably have some thoughts on this. The first one is often, I talked about data, and I talked how critical that is to most of this application space. And the first question you often ask is, does that data exist? Like, there's a lot of things when I started out in my career in this space of like what I wanted to build, and then the reality of like, what could I actually get access to? And the places where I had success and where Google has had a success, and you know, some of the things I look at Google Transit, are when there was sort of this perfectly aligned thing between the incentives of people who could produce data and the folks who could consume data. One Bus Away was sort of born out of a random conversation I'd had at a Seattle Transit blog meetup, where I was complaining about the usability of the real-time data we had in King County at the time, which, if anybody remembers, almost 17 years ago, you know, almost 20 years ago, it was not great. There was no phone number you could call. There was no apps. There was no iPhone. And I spent a lot of time standing in the rain waiting for buses that never came, and that was pretty frustrating. And I met somebody at an STB meetup. He's like, hey, there's actually this data set that they just put out from King County that you know, might help there. And indeed, it did help. It was like sort of this Rosetta Stone that allowed me to connect some bits of pieces that were coming out of the real-time data with what you experienced in the street, which is like, what is the bus stop you're actually at? And that was sort of you know, a moment that kind of launched that application. But the same thing kind of happens for Google in terms of the original meeting between TriMet and Google Maps back in 2005 that ultimately bore the GTFS spec and Google Transit itself. So those are good examples, but there's a lot of examples I've seen where people put out data in a format and they're like, this is great, and then nobody uses it because there wasn't the demand on the other side. Or consumers are looking to build a really cool application that is struggle because the thing they need just really doesn't exist. There's a lot to be said about standards in this space, and I'm suspicious that Eric's gonna have plenty to say about that in the next session, so I'm gonna hold my tongue on that. But even once you've kind of got this perfect alignment between people want to produce data, people want to consume data, standards to make it easy to exchange in a common format, you quickly run into all the other ugly parts of what's the quality of that data? What's the maintenance story for that data? What is the licensing story for that data? Not the fun part. What is the access to that data for a variety of folks? And what's the bias in that data? I talked about imagery, I talked about UGC, I talked about third-party data formats. There are places in the US and beyond that get really frequent satellite imagery updates and flybys with like multi-centimeter imagery, and there are places that don't. There are municipalities who have the resources to produce great third-party data sets and maintain them over time, and then there are places that don't. There's UGC that reflects the users who are giving feedback on their apps, and then you ask the question of like, who are we missing in that story? So there's always trade-offs in the space. We're always missing parts of the story, and we're always trying to fill that in. We're always trying to fill in the map, I like to say. I think the conversation we're here having today is a big part of that. I talked a little bit about the history of GTFS. And really, that is sort of the success story of GTFS is like, yes, it's a success of a data standard, but it was really a success of, this perfect moment in time where there was like a need and someone who's willing to provide the thing, and they met up and made great things happen and launched a huge, an ecosystem that'll, thousands of people, or well, thousands of data producers, consumers in this ecosystem, and literally billions of people around the world depend on and benefit from. I can point to other examples where it didn't quite go so well, and you can look back and say, what were we missing there? Like, something wasn't quite aligned. And maybe we can speak to some of that in the discussion at the end. I want to talk about Google and what we do, and don't worry, I'm going to not talk about Google this entire time. Why doesn't Google provide more data tools? And there's we consume a lot of stuff, especially in the transit and mobility space. But we haven't always provided, we've often get the question, why don't you just provide a GTFS editor or a thing, like everyone would use it. And the reality is, there's some complex ecosystem stuff here where anybody who's in the space knows that it can be pretty fragmented in terms of the tools, the systems, the vendors involved. And we depend on a lot of those vendors to produce data for us and other folks in the ecosystem. And Google was and still is a little nervous about getting into that space, even in a well-meaning way, because I think a lot of folks in the space are always worried about, well, what is Google doing next? What is Google going to move into the space, take the thing we're doing? And we do want that ecosystem to flourish. And so I think, for better or worse, Google has been a little hesitant to provide some direct tooling in the space, especially where it can sort of compete with some of the existing vendors in the space who do a lot of good things for the ecosystem. Some things I can complain about too. But I want to call that out. So since we missed the beginning there, these are all hard questions you should ask a Google Maps engineer if you ever get the question. So I'm going to keep asking harder and harder questions, and I think hopefully we'll get some more at the end there. Why doesn't Google provide better support for blank? And blank can be a lot of different things. I'm sure everyone in this room probably has a list, an own personal list. And I'll be pretty upfront about it. We're a mass market mapping application, which is primarily chasing the most users we can for the features we build. And I've had to turn down a lot of great ideas of my own, the teams, other teams, because there's limits of what we can do as engineers. And there's increasingly market forces that drive what we do. And so that, at the end of the day, being blunt about it, we can't build everything we want, even when we want to. We try to do a few things well, and even that can be challenging, and it can be challenging to do everything. But it's interesting to talk about the biases here. Not a secret, Google, Bay Area tech company. I think you can feel that in the DNA of Google Maps, in that it is a product primarily focused on driving, first and foremost. And you can see that in the investment. You can see that in the emails I get from execs when, are more likely to get an email from an exec about something broken on a highway than I am on transit, though it does happen. But even on the transit side, there's weird quirks of history that the Google Transit team for a long time was based in Zurich, and I famously moved to Zurich for 3 years to work on the Google Transit team, which is a place that famously the trains run on time. And I think Google actually sort of, I don't want to say missed the boat, but was not as quick to do more in the real-time space for transit, because I think the users in that city just didn't really feel the pain of buses being late, because it just didn't happen very often. And so it's funny quirks of history of why things are sort of the way they are. Google's also a lot about scale. So even if we know we can do something in one city, the question we immediately ask is like, well, what do we do for the next 500 cities? And that can sometimes hold us back in ways that I think smaller, more nimbler folks can do better on. And so the reality is a lot of the, one of the features I'm more proud of around accessibility, bike share, et cetera, are often 20% volunteer efforts as opposed to like well-funded things within Google. Not necessarily a bad thing. I'm both, proud of that and wish it was a little bit better. So I said I wouldn't talk so much about Google. And I think the great news is there is a really diverse ecosystem of applications out there today that are filling a variety of niches that you don't need one mapping app to do everything. And I don't think one mapping app really could do everything. So I think there's a variety of players with different sizes, different business models, different motivations, and I think that's a great thing. I'm going to briefly touch on some of this. Hard questions that I always get. What about OSM? What about Overture? And I think there may be some interesting questions for the other Brian about that one coming up. Famously, Google Maps doesn't use OSM data. I think this is primarily something, mostly about licensing. That's part of it, but mostly Google was one of the few companies who did put in the investment of like, we're gonna try to go build our own map of the world. And right now, for better or worse, Google still sees that as sort of a competitive differentiator in the market, especially when we look at where maps are heading. I think there's plenty of pieces of the map that are commoditized, and I mean that in a good way. Access to imagery, access to algorithms, access to data has just gotten cheaper at the base, which is great for everyone. But there's still a lot of things when it comes to navigation, detailed nav, indoor, where it's still expensive to get involved, and the big players still are trying to protect their moats where they can. So I would love, there's many points in my career where I'm like, this would just be a lot easier if we were all just editing one map. And for complicated reasons, I'm not sure that's gonna happen anytime soon, though we get a little bit closer all the time. What can we learn about One Bus Away? Or what can we learn from One Bus Away, an OpenTripPlanner? Famously, I did start the One Bus Away project here at UW, and I walked away from it when I graduated to a certain extent. And despite that, the project has continued, and it still lives on, and it's still used by plenty of people here in Seattle, which I think shows both that there is a path for open source initiatives, endeavors. I think you look at the success of OpenTripPlanner, but it's also hard. I know the work they've had to do just to keep it where it is. And I looked at that calculus myself of impact versus the path I would have trying to make One Bus Away bigger, better. And I went to Google, and I still struggle with the decision over time. Like, I've worked on a lot of great things at Google. I've worked on some terrible things at Google. On balance, I think it's played out, but it's one that it's finding sustainable paths for these applications is hard, and it's a battle that never goes away. So, which is not to undersell like the value of doing it, but just calling that out. So, all right, I know we're already out of time. We lost some time in their start, so I'm going to stop, and I look forward to some great questions coming up.
So welcome. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about open data and open source tooling. I'm Brian Housel. I'm thrilled to be part of Open the Paths 2025. So first, a little bit about me. This issue of how our tools can influence the data that we collect and play a role in the kinds of maps that we make. This is something that I've been working closely with for the past 10 years or so. So for about 6 years, I was the maintainer of OpenStreetMap's ID editor. And during my time with that project, we saw it as our mission to really make map editing fun and easy. We really wanted to grow the OpenStreetMap community as much as possible. And so that meant building a tool that a casual mapper could just pick up and learn in like 15 minutes or so and just start contributing useful data without a lot of training. And then more recently, I've been working with Meta on their Rapid Map Editor. I know that that's being used by AccessMap, and a bunch of people in this room are pretty familiar with it. Rapid started out as a fork of ID, but has since been mostly rewritten to improve performance and make it more than just a map editor for OpenStreetMap, but also a tool for merging in open data. So quick intro to the Rapid Map Editor. Meta launched this tool in 2019 because they wanted to more effectively fill in the gaps of missing data in OpenStreetMap. Some places in OpenStreetMap, are very well mapped, others not so much. And, because Meta had based their maps on OpenStreetMap, they had business reasons for wanting the map to be more complete. So in 2019, they used AI to detect roads from aerial imagery, and they made that data openly available. And they needed a simple tool that could show both the OpenStreetMap and also the additional AI features and allow humans to verify and accept or ignore those suggestions. So around this time, Microsoft released their global AI detected building footprints, and this made it into Rapid also. And Esri was also interested in giving a lot of their clients an easy way to comply with open data laws and contribute their GIS data into the commons. So Rapid kind of grew out of this need for several businesses to improve OpenStreetMap with open data. It's probably just easiest to show what Rapid does with a short demo. So here I'm going to start the video up. I'm going to add some AI detected Microsoft buildings to OpenStreetMap in a place in Pennsylvania that doesn't have any buildings mapped yet. So you open the menu, you add Microsoft buildings, and you can see, these purple shapes here. Now, you could choose to accept or ignore them. These are suggestions by AI. In some places, this works better than others, but around here, they look pretty good. It kind of depends on how good the imagery is that these shapes were trained on. So for each one, you can click accept. You can sort of move the shape around with the cursor. You can make any adjustments to the tagging or the shape that you need. And you don't have to click that accept button each time. We do have keyboard shortcuts. So our users can be very efficient in reviewing these suggestions. Still, it's important to us that there is a human in the loop. These aren't like automated edits or imports, which the OpenStreetMap community discourages. In Rapid, the user does actually have to click on each thing and make a decision about it. So over time, we've grown the open data catalog in Rapid that our users can access. Like I said before, Rapid started with Facebook's AI roads, Microsoft's AI buildings, and added to it a growing catalog of data contributed by Esri's GIS clients. We knew that the performance of the tool was struggling to keep up with even the base OpenStreetMap data, so we spent most of 2022 improving the rendering code. And we released Rapid version 2 in early 2023. We rewrote this rendering code to switch from a SVG-based map to a WebGL-based map, and I'm going to say more on that on the next few slides. But the list of open data sets has continued to grow, both through the Esri portal and also adding Google AI detected buildings in 2023, and then Overture's Open Places data set in 2024. It's come up before, like the other Brian said, Overture is a really interesting project, and I'm looking forward to seeing more open data releases from them. It's very cool when you get a bunch of big companies all just sort of, working on one problem together. So finally, the most recent addition to Rapid's data catalog, probably most interesting to this audience, is a data set called Open Map Footways. We added this just last December, and it combines publicly available footway data from 5 cities around the United States: Boston, Philadelphia, Denver, and Salt Lake City. We're hoping to kind of grow that collection over time. I'm going to talk a bit more about that WebGL rewrite. This is something that really had to happen for Rapid to serve our users. So previous versions of the tool, Rapid version 1 and ID. Oh, wait, we'll go back. I'll start this video up. Sorry. There we go. This is a place called Cape Coral, Florida, where people have just added a whole lot of detail. And you can see how laggy the map is. People have added street lamps, benches, sidewalks, driveways. In OpenStreetMap, people can add whatever they want, and sometimes they sort of, they just really add a lot of detail. Rapid version 1 and ID could not even keep up with the detail around this place. In fact, even in this screen recording, a lot of the detail has been pulled out of the screen, and it's still very laggy. It's pretty much unusable as a map editor. So you can imagine, even if we can't show all of OpenStreetMap here, forget about adding more open data on top of it. Go ahead to next. So we really had to take a pause and rewrite Rapid's core rendering technology. For version 2, we ditched that SVG code and kind of rewrote it, replacing it with a JavaScript video game library called Pixie.js. Now it uses WebGL to render the map. It looks almost exactly like it did before, except obviously we can show all of the detail on this map. Maybe in this screen recording, we're showing a little too much. But even in this densely mapped place, we're able to show everything. The GPU is doing a lot of the work for us. And this is a great example of really kind of the topic of this panel, how the tools can really influence or limit the kind of data that we can collect. You know, as our map making tools improve, we can build maps at higher levels of detail than was previously thought possible. I'm going to continue. So now, what kinds of open data can we work with? I'm going to show another example of the data collection, the data catalog in action. Here we're looking around Chester County, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Philadelphia. The map here has roads, but not much else. And so we can open up our data catalog, and I can say add data sets. I'm going to search for the word Chester, and we're going to add some data sets provided by Chester County's GIS through Esri's community data sharing program. So now the map can show all these other features that can be accepted into OSM, used to improve OSM. Buildings are in teal, addresses are in yellow. We also have some footway center lines shown in magenta here. These are provided by the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. And so partnerships like these really make a better map possible. If you have data in ArcGIS already and the license is open, it might actually be very easy for you to get it added to our catalog so that OpenStreetMap users can make use of it. Next slide. Here we go. And finally, one more example. I thought this audience might want to see a bit more about the open data for the Open Footways data set that we have. So this time we're looking around Denver, Colorado. And this is a good place to look because the data is mostly really good. But the sidewalks are already mostly unmapped in OpenStreetMap. So the magenta line strings here, I don't know if you see my cursor, they contain both sidewalks and crossing provided by the Denver Regional Council of Governments. I don't know if people know, sometimes people call that Dr. Cog. I think that's like a fun name for them. But anyway, what's great is that this data set has already been matched up with the appropriate OpenStreetMap tags up here. In the left sidebar, you can see things like where it says highway footway, footway sidewalk. You have to know a little bit about OpenStreetMap in order to know sort of like what these tags mean. So that can be a bit of a barrier to getting open data into a tool like this. And the data also comes with this this source tag. It says Denver Open Data Catalog is, I guess, what they wanted to go with. And finally, one other useful thing to point out on this screen is that the feature service we're fetching the data from has conflated the line strings against OpenStreetMap. So in this screenshot, you might be able to see along the west side of this arterial road, Autumn Sage Street, there's already an OpenStreetMap sidewalk, so we don't show an additional magenta like sidewalk suggestion here. So as we've seen, Rapid makes the open data available, but we also need a community of people to review that data and actually add it to the map. So we've partnered with another great open source tool called MapRoulette. Just keeping on the topic of tooling, MapRoulette is a microtasking tool. And the way that this tool works is anybody can create challenges on the MapRoulette site for volunteers to work on. So a challenge might be something like open the map in the spot, review certain features for correctness, and the user is presented with some options like I fixed it or it was too hard, I couldn't complete the task. Meta has created an initiative called the Walkabout Project, where we partnered with youth mappers and other local community groups to improve the pedestrian network in cities of interest. And this has been a valuable tool to organize volunteer mappers. And then just last year, the Rapid team added a built-in integration between Rapid and MapRoulette to make this even easier. So you can complete MapRoulette tasks without even leaving the Rapid tool. And we've had a lot of success in getting pedestrian features mapped this way. So here's a short video of this MapRoulette integration in action. This is Philadelphia here. Meta used machine learning to detect places around Philadelphia where we think that a crossing is mistagged or missing. So you can enable this MapRoulette layer in Rapid. You see the tasks show up as these green markers. And if you click on any of the markers, you get some information on the side about what the task is that you're supposed to do. This is a place where some marked crossings are visible on the imagery, but they're missing from the map. So we can use Rapid to very quickly add the missing crossings and then click back. We're going to tag these as a zebra crossing. And then we'll click back on the green marker and you can click that button at the bottom that says I fixed it, just to let everybody know that the issue has been addressed. So it kind of turns mapping into a game. But the other side benefit is it gives our project coordinators some statistics on how much work is being done. So let's see some results. Through the Walkabout project, Meta has been running challenges like this for a while, and we've seen some real success in improving the pedestrian network in OpenStreetMap in the cities that we're focused on. About a month ago, my colleague Chad Blevins published a post on the OpenStreetMap US blog. It's down here. And he shared the results of this work. You should check out the post, but I did want to summarize some of the results for this audience. The first chart here shows an increase in kilometers of footways added to OpenStreetMap. So we tracked the increase in footway coverage in these cities, and we found out that not only are the footways being added, but we're speeding up. So in every city, we saw a bunch more added in 2024 versus 2023. Some cities like Phoenix saw some really huge increases. And I think in that case, it's a few committed volunteers were able to really move the needle a lot and just make a big difference in the completeness of the pedestrian network there. I like to look at this and, I like to say, oh, the tools are getting better too. Maybe that's why we're able to map more sidewalks. We'll see. Next, we also have similar data on crossings. We saw a similar trend in almost every city where, we're not only adding crossings, but the number added in 2024 is higher than the number added in 2023. Everywhere except Los Angeles. I don't know why that is. But crossings are super important to pedestrian safety, as everybody at this conference knows. They can also be a bit more difficult to map properly, and adding them can be more time consuming because they require a little more knowledge to identify the important tags, such as the markings, the signals, the curbs. And unlike sidewalks that are mostly visible from aerial imagery, sometimes with crossings, it requires some quality street level imagery so that you can get a complete perspective of the crossing situation. But the good news is we are making progress in getting sidewalks and crossings mapped. And these are encouraging numbers that we hope to see increase and continue. So I'm almost out of time. Just to wrap up, thank you everyone for listening. I always like to end a talk with an ask. And for this one, the ask is to just get involved. Or if you're already involved, like many of you are, thank you for keeping these projects alive. There are lots of ways to help out. Probably the best resource right now is the OpenStreetMap US Pedestrian Working Group. This group is coordinating efforts on open data and mapping standards. If you're a data owner or even know of any open data that you want to see added to tools like Rapid, you can reach out to myself or the people on the Pedestrian Working Group to take the next steps in putting that data to use. And finally, last, please support the open source tools like Rapid and MapRoulette. Support can come in many forms. You don't feel like you need to have to code. Even if you just use the tools and you provide feedback to developers about what could be improved, that's important too. So that's it. Thank you very much.
I'll try to follow on from Brian and Brian, who have each given me some good material to work with. But I'd like to say thanks for inviting me to be here. I'd like to talk maybe about some more conceptual things that touch on some of what Brian and Brian each presented. But unlike the Brian who just spoke, I like to put my ask at the very beginning, just in case anyone loses interest in hearing my voice after a few minutes. So if you're not already familiar with Mobility Data, the organization that I lead, dedicated to better transportation through data, please connect with us or with me. I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I'll actually be out your way in May for the TRB Data and AI conference. In case those of you watching the screen see a dog jump up on my lap, it's my dog Data. Just so you know who you're dealing with here. I began my career in a year not starting with the number 2, and I'm really excited to be in this field now, just to kind of step back and say a lot of folks professionally don't get to work in a field where there is as much potential or where as much is changing as all of us who are thinking about these things. So I'm always an optimist. I'm really excited to be doing this stuff, and I think that mobility data really has a unique role to play. And I'd like to thank Brian Ferris for being suspicious of me talking about data and standards. Of course, I will do that. But I will say that a lot of folks share the vision of a world where everyone has access to the kind of transportation options that will improve their lives. And at Mobility Data, we really are focused on creating, maintaining, advocating for the adoption of, improving the quality of the data standards that I think we need to accomplish this. We need more than data, we need more than standards, but if people don't have access to information about the travel options that are open to them, that is a huge barrier. But there are other barriers too, and thinking about what is the role of the public sector, what is the role of the private sector, I always like to talk about the video cassette recorder format wars of the early 1980s. Many of you may not have ever seen a videotape, but back in the late 70s and early 80s, there were competing formats for videotapes. There was the VHS tape, which you may have heard about because ultimately that won the format war. And there was the beta format tape, which many of you may not have heard of because that lost the format war. And I use this example because I don't think that there is a long-term case to be made for proprietary data formats, at least not in certain areas. Plenty of companies were able to make money selling video cassette recorders after the industry converged on the VHS standard. I think that until you actually have practical standards in an industry, you may get the early adopters who are willing to take a chance, like my uncle, who I don't tell him I said this, but he's the example I always use because he's the last guy on earth, I think, who bought a beta VCR before beta sort of faded out. But you may get early adopters who are willing to take a chance on a format that hasn't become standardized, but you're not going to have access to the mass market because a lot of people are going to wait out buying something or committing to something if they're data producers or data consumers until they know what standard is going to prevail. So I think there's a case to be made for open transport data standards, and that's what we do at Mobility Data. And I appreciate Brian Ferris, who of course was absolutely instrumental in the history of GTFS and in the development model that we have, the general transit feed specification. I think that we have learned a lot about what has worked from that development model, and I think we've tried to apply it to some of the other data standards that we're now involved with, the general bike share feed specification, the transit ITS, I think it's been renamed the Transit Integrated Data Exchange specification, the Transit Operational Data specification, and also the sort of umbrella structure having to do with data interoperability called the Mobility Data Interoperability Principles. And part of what we've learned from the GTFS development model, and for those of you who are looking at this on the screen, you can sort of see, I'll talk through the left column, which is where we try to be at Mobility Data, and the right column, which represents kind of an other way to think about standards development. As I said, I don't think there's much of a long-term business case to be made, at least in certain areas, for having proprietary data standards because you can't have access to the whole market until the industry converges on a standard. And kind of like Winston Churchill once said about democracy, sometimes it seems like open standards are the worst kind, except for all of the other ones. And I'll get back to that in a minute, kind of the human side of data and standards development. But we want to make sure that as much as possible, we're talking about global development involving a global community and trying to bring some connection to all of the individual efforts that are happening in different regions and in different sectors. We want to have industry buy-in from the beginning so that things happen by consensus rather than have necessarily a top-down, regulatory-driven, government-based approach. I think one of the big successes of GTFS was that the tangible benefits of using GTFS were so clear that it didn't take a regulatory requirement to get transit agencies to start using it. And if we can be as clear about a benefits-based approach rather than a regulatory-based approach when it comes to other areas we might look to bring transportation data standards to, I think there's an enormous amount of potential. We try to focus on the traveler, although we know that there are other parts of the transportation data area that can benefit from having standards. operations and maintenance and other kinds of back-end functions. Sometimes, unless that's addressed, you can't provide the kind of high-quality traveler information you really want. Thinking about how we get to sort of a minimum viable product and develop it from there, rather than try to come up with something that contains every conceivable feature before it launches, and really focusing on the real world use cases like, oh, if we adopt this standard, then we can appear in all of your mapping apps of choice. That's something that you can show to folks on your phone. Hey, our thing is appearing here, as opposed to something that might be more theoretical or research based. Obviously, there's a place for research and theory, but for making sure that something is actually happening, we want to focus on real world use cases. And there are different ways to try to fund this. I will say that especially now, I think the benefits of having a member-supported approach are certainly clear to us at Mobility Data, because some of the alternatives, whether having a licensing fee, which is kind of at odds with the principles of really open development, where there would be kind of a paywall to participate. I mean, that's not what we're talking about when we talk about open development. Or even looking at having primary support come from the government, where it's always very uncertain and you're subject to some of the changes that we're seeing now. We want to make sure that we can sustain this work going forward, because there's a lot we want to use standards for. We want to provide better traveler information. We want to think about how we can reduce the cost and complexity of service by improving the back end. We want to think about making progress on policy goals. We want to grow the market for innovative hardware, software, and services. And the shift that I talk about a lot is, as much as possible, I want to think about how we can transform the role of data and standards from describing the world as it is to thinking about how we can use data and standards as a foundation for providing new kinds of transportation services, systems, options, business models that don't exist at all yet. And when we have access to a global community, we really see that innovation can come from anywhere. And I think we have a lot to learn, at least in North America, from the rest of the world, where there's just tremendous innovation happening in transportation. So I want to talk a little bit about who, because if I can kind of recharacterize something Brian Ferris said a little bit, I think that as hard as tech problems are, whether it's wrangling data or doing the development work that goes into standards, the tech work is hard. I think that what I call the human side is harder, because you're dealing with people who have lots of different motivations, and you're dealing with some of the concepts that Brian and Brian talked about: liability, ownership and licensing of data, business models. These are all human questions. They're not technical questions. And so when we think about, okay, who are the humans who are part of this development process, I think it's important for certainly us at Mobility Data, and I think it's important for the community broadly, to really think about who are all of the different audiences, constituencies, organizations, people that need to be involved in the process. Because many of us who are tech-minded sometimes default to thinking about data producers, where the data comes from. And even there, we sometimes lose sight of the fact that, well, data producers don't have to be limited to the kind of conventional sources that we're all aware of, whether it's transit agencies, shuttle operations, mapping providers, consultants, maybe data coming from AI sources. But data producers can be of an unconventional nature. And again, the human part of the equation is, I think, what gives us the complications that may not allow us ever to sort of converge on one data set to rule them all. I mean, I always say that one data set to rule them all is a great goal in theory, but as hard as the tech would be, and the tech might be an insuperable problem by itself, the human problems of having one data set to rule them all are even greater. The governance, the the involvement of all these different constituencies. And I think that makes the role of standards even more important. But I think a lot of us who work in this area tend to default to thinking about data producers and also data consumers, the ways in which information is provided to users, whether it's Google Maps or OSM or any of the other data consumers that are there. Sometimes we forget about some of the other groups that are involved, like users. As I say, we try to differentiate between individual travelers as the ultimate users of the data that are formatted and presented according to standards. But there are other potential users as well, including the operators and managers of different pieces of transportation infrastructure, different transportation systems. But even for travelers, are we really thinking about the people who are going to need access to this information? How can we present information in the most effective way? And again, I think a lot of us default to it. Certainly I do. I mean, I'm, here I am talking about VHS and beta videotapes. I'm old enough that I still look at the cell phone, the smartphone, and I say, wow, this is great. We can put information in the hands of everyone, except you only have to think about it for about half a second to realize, well, that actually doesn't get you everyone. So how are we thinking about all of the travelers who are going to need access to this information if we're serious about achieving our top level policy goals? And then how are we thinking about the developers, the innovators here? You know, as I say, I'm really interested in who can take the data and standards that we're involved in creating, not as an endpoint, but as a starting point for thinking about the new systems, the new services, the new options that don't exist yet. How do we find out even who those folks are? They may not have identified themselves yet. How can we stoke interest in that kind of innovation? I didn't want to make it sound a couple of minutes ago as though I was down on early adopters, by the way. I think early adopters are tremendously important because nothing ever gets off the ground unless there are early adopters willing to take a chance on making something work. And we have to be thoughtful about the trade-offs between early adopters and everyone else, because it's an interesting kind of thing. Imagine if the US government had said in 1980, well, we have decided in Washington, D.C., that the United States is going to adopt beta as the official video cassette recorder format for all time. That would have been a huge mistake. And so there's kind of this tough inflection point that needs to be found out. When does the lack of a standard spur innovation, and when does it become a constraint preventing you from going beyond early adopters? If you can work with the public sector and the private sector on this benefits-based, real-world use case approach rather than a top-down government approach, I think it puts you in a much better position to identify when that point comes and to think about how vendors of hardware and software and consulting services and other kinds of vendors can be involved in this conversation so that they have an incentive to support open standards, because as I say, it gives them access much more quickly to the whole market. And just to say, I don't think we spend enough time, we not necessarily this group in particular, but in the field, there's not as much attention on the workforce as I think there really ought to be. Who's going to be involved in creating the data, in maintaining the data, in doing all of the kinds of analysis and quality checking that is going to be needed? And how do we make sure that on the regulatory and government side, people in those agencies can be in a position where they're independent, where they're neutral, where they're thoughtful, where they're, hopefully in a position of trust so that they can make decisions that are going to get us where we want to go. Also, I want to put in a plug, not just for messaging to the public at large and citizens, but especially for kids. I'm one of those transportation people, and some of you may be this kind of person also, who grew up with a fascination about all of this stuff that I never lost. People say to me, how did you get into transportation? I said, I'm the same person I was when I was a kid, fascinated by all this. How did you get out of it? I don't know how people get out of this. I don't understand about getting into it. We also want to be thoughtful about how we engage with researchers and the academic community, and how we can be thoughtful about working with professional associations like the Transportation Research Board and others, and certainly the role of independent nonprofit international organizations like Mobility Data that hopefully can play a role in advancing the technology, of course, but also thinking about that kind of human engagement and being a connector between all these different kinds of audiences. Everyone has to be involved if we are going to really achieve our mission of better transportation through data. Thanks for listening, and I hope there's still time for questions.
Can folks online hear me with this mic? Fantastic. So thanks so much for all three talks. I think I'm tempted to kind of go a little bit off script here, just based on the last talk, and I'm gonna go ahead and do that because I have the mic. I have kind of a difficult relationship with standards, and I want to hear people's response to this. So I, as a grad student, I worked in oceanography for a while, and I was really excited to go to a standards creation meeting, and they were talking about how to represent salinity and temperature, and it was a sensor observation standard. So there's sensors that go up and down in the water, and they get dragged behind boats, and everything you can imagine is out there, and so there's a lot of heterogeneity. And 5 years later, I went back to another workshop. They were talking about standards, and I swear the exact same conversations were being discussed. So there's this kind of it's never quite done. We've got to the artifact of the standard itself becomes the goal as opposed to the applications enabled by the standard. I think this community is doing a much better job thanks to the folks on the panel. But is there a concern about premature standardization is the root of all evil, or the amount of time you can take? And I guess I'm looking here at Brian because he's here in the room, so maybe that's fair. So maybe I'll start with you.
Anything? Yeah, here we go. It is true that making standards is hard. Like watching the sausage get made is not pleasant. And it can take a lot of time. I was reminded recently at a conference where GTFS Flex finally adopted after a lot of work. And somebody reminded and Brian, you wrote this doc 10 years ago that became the basis for this. And I'm like, I don't even remember that doc. It just took so long to get everything aligned to make that happen. So it is hard. I think there's some guiding principles on GTFS specifically around really not focusing on speculative features, really only adding, there's a whole talk we could talk about the guiding principles behind GTFS and why I think it helped to be successful, but really concisely, focusing on only adding things where there's an identified consumer and producer who's already willing to use it, kind of helped you avoid adding things that ended up never being used by anybody. I think GTFS has had, I think it's in a good place right now. I'm going to give so many plugs for Eric and Mobility Data as an organization, but especially for their work facilitating the GTFS spec. As someone who's facilitated the spec over time and someone has seen it kind of wither on the vine when it didn't have a great facilitation role, it's hard. You got to put in the work, and there's no easy way to get, the human element, as Eric alluded, is the hard part of getting people to agree. And I'm still on working groups today where there's big gaps between people in the room, and that never gets easier. So working with people is the hard part. The tech is often the easy part.
Thanks for that. Eric, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, obviously Brian is right. This is very hard work, but I think the payoff is that if you can have a system where standards are playing the role that they ought to, then it's kind of a middle ground between a real mess where every person has to reinvent the information they're getting every time they want to go anywhere because they don't know what is a trusted source. They might switch from one platform to another. There's no way to share information between different platforms. Everything would be completely fragmented without standards. And I think in addition to individual people not getting the information that they need, you would have the private sector and the public sector in a complete mess. You don't have the private sector business opportunities that you have if standards allow you to have some confidence in the data that's being created, and you don't have a public sector ability to do anything to try to encourage policy goals, because you probably can't measure anything when there's no baseline to compare it against. So that's kind of one way to fail without standards. On the other side, I think to fail without standards is this idea that, and look, I mean, I've been working in this field a long time, and it's a very tempting thought to those of us who have spent a lot of time on this, the sort of one data set to rule them all approach. But that I think is just not a practical way to try to go ahead with things, because who would be in charge of making those decisions? What would the governance process be? If you tried to put everything that you could possibly think of, it's the opposite of the approach that Brian was just describing with GTFS. It would be almost impossible. There would be no opportunity to think about innovation, because you'd be constrained by, it's the equivalent of trying to pick beta as the videotape format in 1980. And I don't really know what the private sector incentive would be to be part of that. Who would want to be trying to come up with new business models, new services, new systems, new opportunities if everything was too tightly controlled? So the middle ground, I think, is to have this kind of open standards development process where, sure, it's messy, it's hard, it takes a long time sometimes, but I think that for me, one of the key lessons that I'm trying to put words to, and I don't know if I'm going to say this in quite the right way yet, but I think one of the things I'm seeing is that when we think about how many standards do we need, or who should be involved, or what the technical areas should be, it seems to me more and more that the case for a new standard is largely driven by the who needs to be involved in that standard, and not so much the tech, because the tech, as I say, is hard, but the human side is harder. So if you have a standard where you say, okay, we have a kind of workable area where we know who needs to be involved in the development, we know who needs to be involved in the governance, we know who needs to be involved in making sure that we're actually accomplishing something. I think that's a way of making sure that you're only focusing your development efforts on things that are probably going to work.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic. Brian Housel, do you want to?
Yeah, so I have some thoughts. I mean, I work with OpenStreetMap. So, the standards there are sort of, they don't even really have standards. It's more of sort of the consensus around the way to do things. And they do have some processes for achieving consensus. But a lot of times in OpenStreetMap, the data is a bit chaos, particularly around the people in this audience probably know about crossings, how maybe the first people to sort of be interested in crossings a while ago were in the United Kingdom. And so the early sort of standard way of mapping crossings in OpenStreetMap is very UK centric, where there's like zebras and toucans and pelicans and all of these words that only really mean something if you're, in the United Kingdom and you know what that is. And so over time, we've been trying to kind of, bring the community to a place where, we can make some OpenStreetMap tags that really work for the kinds of crossings that are found all around the world. Again, I'll give a pitch for that pedestrian working group, because this is a lot of what they're really hoping to achieve, is just to say, hey, there are many different ways to map something, and it's not like there's necessarily, they don't use the words right or wrong, but sort of like there's maybe the base way of mapping it, and then there's sort of higher levels of detail that you can achieve if you want to really get into what the markings look like, what the curb ramps look like, if there's buttons and signals and other sort of accessible features at a crossing. So I guess this is my roundabout way of saying, I see the value of standardization. I kind of wish OSM had more of it, but I think that we're headed to a place where people who have some skin in the game can actually drive the standardization forward a little bit.
That's great. Thanks for educating me once again on some of the value here. There's maybe a little more directly to the point of the session here. Between tools and standards and different data sources, there's a lensing that happens that kind of affects downstream applications, right? So you can kind of collect from there was a conversation earlier about I guess Brian, you mentioned the sort of historical idiosyncrasies kind of lead to what we have and what we don't have sometimes. Other times it's design decisions. Other times it's technological capability. All these different sources of biases, influence what we can do downstream. And that's maybe a fact of life, but is there anything we can do to expose and maybe kind of mitigate those biases and kind of invest in ironing that out a little bit? Or is it just sort of a fact of life that we need to live with? And I don't mean to only go in one order, so maybe I'll maybe I'll ask folks online if anybody wants to jump in on that. But the sort of biases that we end up creating in our tooling and our sourcing and our standards, limiting what we can do downstream, especially in the context of perhaps the goal of the workshop here at Open the Paths.
Well, I'm happy to start with that. I just in January sort of taught a mini graduate class at MIT here in Cambridge called Transportation Data and Applications, and it was all about the human side of data, where I said there's so much talk about data-driven decisions, but there's not as much talk about decision-driven data. And as you say, all of the biases that are kind of captured, whether unintentionally or not, in the data sets and in the data standards that we have. The example that I talked about in January was actually not about transit or the things that we've been talking about really in this session, but looking at roadway safety data, which comes from local law enforcement for the most part. And whenever anyone says, oh, in the US, there were 40-something thousand transportation fatalities in 2024, they're referring to a federal database that is supposed to be fed from local law enforcement. And you only have to stop and think about this for a pretty short time to realize that, well, there are tens of thousands of local law enforcement jurisdictions in the United States. And although there actually is a crash data reporting standard that exists, its use is uncertain because there's no way to track how many of these jurisdictions are using it, how complete the data sets are, how many incidents are ever even reported to law enforcement, how many times law enforcement submits a complete report. And so if you think about every stage of that process, how important is this? Where does the data come from? What kind of quality checking is done? I think that the crash data reporting system really could benefit from involving some of the audiences that I tried to highlight in my presentation. How are we thinking about who needs to be part of this conversation so that at the very least, we can be as open and honest as we can before we develop something about the potential biases in terms of, well, what data does someone think is important in the first place? And who are those people and why do they think it's important? And what about other people who think other things are important? How do we try to have the conversation about what is to be included? And then where does the data come from and who's involved in collecting it? Who's involved in processing it? How is it going to be formatted? How is it going to be presented to different audiences? How is it going to be used for decision making? So for me, I think that the two things are making sure that folks are involved in the governance and development process from the outset, but also, when I say that I think we're kind of limited by human considerations more than technical considerations, I think for every standard we need to give ourselves the flexibility for that standard to evolve and change, not just because we have new use cases or because we have new technical problems or because we have new opportunities to tackle new things, but because we will find problems. We will uncover new biases that were not part of the original conversations that we will want to correct for. And if we don't build in some flexibility, then we're not going to allow ourselves to make those corrections. I mean, I studied planning, and one of the things that I try to fight against so hard is the traditional planner's curse, which is I think every generation of planners and planning students thinks, well, all the people who came before me, although they were all well-intentioned, they were wrong. But now I have finally solved the problem and I am right. I mean, we have to make sure that we're giving ourselves the ability to error correct down the line.
Thanks so much. So maybe on the tool side as well, because there's maybe a different set of biases that get introduced when we start developing these tools.
Yeah,
Yeah, go
absolutely.
ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. Yeah, as a the developer myself, I try to be aware that like, look, I speak English, I have reasonable eyesight and hearing, and not everybody around this world can use my tool the way that I can. So, trying to foster an environment where you have like a diverse community of users and developers, and just kind of having everybody involved, bring their different perspectives. I said in the previous answer that, hey, the crossings in OSM developed a lot of the way they did because the early people were just British and, know what toucan and whatever is. But I mean, if having more people involved with different perspectives would eliminate a lot of that bias, and so that's why we try to, um, as tool makers, I think I really do try to be aware of that. Make the tool available in ways that people can use it, in different languages with different accessibility needs. And I think that it's just the only way really is to and involve just more people, just a bigger community, a more diverse community. Just more people using it is the way to go.
Thanks for that, Brian.
I'll briefly plus one everything said. User-centered design, user-focused design. If my advisor Alan was here, he'd be waving that flag as well. And it kind of dovetails nicely with the first question about why is making standards hard. Often, again, the human element of getting a diverse set of viewpoints to make sure your standard is representative of the community who wants to, use that standard necessarily makes the process longer. It's harder to get to consensus, but that's an investment worth making. It's easy to like put something on paper that doesn't, it's quick to get to, but doesn't represent the needs of the community. You got to do the work. I don't think there's any other way around it of recognizing those biases, getting a representative set of users, and spending the time to make sure you've reflected on that in the thing you're building, whether it's a standard or software or anything else.
This is great. So something near and dear to my heart is integration, and we saw some examples of pulling together data sets from different sources and putting them into the same tool. And it kind of makes me think that there's sort of two ways data comes about. It's kind of born standardized, and then it's sort of born some other way and has to kind of become standardized in order to be integrated. And I guess my own view would be that you can't get away from the second case, right? There's going to be data. There's going to be sort of big piles of data that comes from somewhere. That is not standards compliant. What's our future here? How much energy do you think you spend on integrating, the soup, as opposed to selling people on using tools that sort of produce a standard in the first place? Where should we invest our work? And I guess bonus points if you comment on what might be happening with generative AI in this space, given that translating between two different formats has become remarkably easier in the last year or two. Maybe Brian Housel?
Yeah. So I would say, so the I don't know, just to reflect on the AI piece, I don't I feel like very left out of what's going on there. Obviously AI is having a moment right now, and I'm not sure what that means for our industry. Honestly, is that certainly it's going to make it. There's a potential future where we can use AI to just generate a lot of data very quickly. Like you could just say, hey, maybe in a few years we'll have high resolution imagery of everywhere, and we'll just be able to detect all the sidewalks and crossings every year, and just publish a massive data set that just has all of that. And we aren't relying on volunteers as much as we do today. And maybe in that future, sort of like that data set, it just whoever does it first gets to define what the standard is, and that's kind of I'm not sure that I'm on board with that, but it's certainly a thing that could happen. I'm sorry, I don't know if that's
I guess not to steer the answer, but I think there's one application is sort of extracting from original sources, which of course folks in the room I think are thinking about, but there's also this frankly easier task of, hey, I've got it in one format, I need you to rewrite it in this other format, please pay attention to the standard. and they do a pretty good job with this kind of translation nowadays. It's not perfect, but it's starting to get better and better.
Well, to say that it gets better and better, I agree with that. I mean, I think it's kind of normal for the first version of something to be a bit of a mess, and then to refine it over time, right? The standards, maybe you might start off with there is no standard, and then people realize the value of having one, and then it sort of evolves. I think like we're kind of going through this right now in mapping with Overture. I know it's come up a few times.
Sure.
Overture I think is a reaction to sort of a lot of things that OpenStreetMap has developed the way it has. With the kind of lack of standardization or just sort of like a bit chaos there. And then, some of the companies that with skin in the game that need maps to just work and be complete and be free of vandalism, they're kind of coming together to say, okay, like this is what we really need the map to do. And then to kind of lay out like a schema that they can all agree on. And again, that's kind of just like a reaction to like, how OSM developed. And so I think that this kind of a conversation that, goes on over time where things start out maybe a bit messy and they kind of come together, based on whatever the needs of the stakeholders are.
That's great.
If I can jump in there real
please.
quick, 2 points. I think the future of AI-generated maps are here. I think increasingly many of the features on many map providers are coming from ML models trained on imagery. Like I think we're here. Like I don't think there's any question. I think my understanding of Overture is sort of like kind of based on that point of that perception, that thought about AI models versus the human element. But it's also interesting to talk about GTFS. This question of like, does the standard need to come first, or can you just find the I mean, it's worth pointing out GTFS was started by Google and 5 North American transit agencies. That is not representative of transit worldwide. And yet, despite all that, we still look at GTFS as sort of a success in this space of, how it evolved to kind of represent this core, consensus-based use case. So, it is often the case that it's like 2 excited people who are like, I have some data and I have something, and they just go make it work, and the standard kind of comes later because they were successful. Maybe in the same way that maybe VHS won because it was, just more widely adopted, and maybe even if Betamax was better. I was a little hazy. I was like 6 at the time. But I do remember seeing both on the wall at the rental store. So anyway, we say the path is often messy. And I will also say, inside Google Baseball, like we have a lot of folks who scour the world for open 3P data sets that often have they're just a shapefile with like whatever convention the local municipality worked with, and do the work of mapping that to our own internal schema. And that has very much been a human problem that is very quickly becoming a solved problem with AI. So to your point about conversion, like I think that's already happening in the industry.
Thanks so much. We're a little low on time. Do you want to give us a quick comment on that?
Maybe I'll add on the sort of other end. I mean, I think that the great temptation of AI is that it can solve what we all recognize is a scalability problem when it comes to how many people need to be involved in collecting data and processing data and handling data and making decisions about data. I think the idea is that wow, AI is going to really reduce the cost of that and the need of human involvement. But to tie it back to your previous question about biases, I was at a conference last year in California, and someone said, I ran an experiment. I asked ChatGPT, how do I get from the airport in LA, how do I get from LAX to the beach in Santa Monica? And ChatGPT provided several options. It said, well, you can rent a car at LAX, or you can take an Uber or a Lyft, or you can get a taxi, or you can reserve a car through something like Getaround or Turo, or you can have a friend drive you there. And the last response it gave in its list, and the tone suddenly changed, was, well, I guess if you have no other options and you have a lot of time to spare and you don't mind going through some unsafe neighborhoods, you can sort of take transit as long as you're not carrying too many things and you have sort of an adventurous spirit. And so, sure, there's this temptation both on the data collection and processing side and kind of on the user interface and tools side that AI can greatly reduce the cost by reducing human involvement. But if it's reinforcing all of the biases that we like to think we're trying to do something about by doing all the work that we're doing, then that's probably not the kind of outcome that we're all going to be comfortable with. So how are we going to make sure that human involvement, even though it's really difficult to scale, but like Brian Ferris says, you've got to do the work, right? Because the alternative is you come up with something that's probably not what you want.
Fantastic, and I think the answer to the question is if it's reinforcing the bias, it definitely is. So that's a great point to end on. So we have about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we have some time for questions from the audience. I've been talking too much here. So I think there's still probably mics floating around, and we have mine and other ones. Okay, great. I kind of sprung it on you. Didn't give you a chance to think yet.
Do we want to go ahead just for time? Jen Mayer, King County Metro. I really appreciated Eric's point about data not driving the decision. We like to say at Metro we're values-driven, data-informed. One of the questions I had for y'all, we have been trying to reframe. We've always done what I like to say we've done a great job at Metro of measuring our system against itself. Like we take the data, we know our own performance. That's the data we have because we're collecting it. It's our system. The data that's been a little more challenging has been, as we've been reframing things, to look about who's getting the benefit of our services. If we have a choice to invest in 2 routes, they're each $1 million, and one of them gets 10,000 riders, one of them gets 20,000, well, maybe that 10,000 don't have any other choice or don't have access to a car, or otherwise it would be a bigger payoff in terms of overall access to opportunity to invest in fewer riders that need it more. And that's where I am challenged, because we have the tendency to look for if we have a data set that's easy to use, that frames the questions we ask sometimes. And is there a way to sort of use the tools we have to get more sensitive to the people who benefit from our services, who are harder to get the data about? Have you seen anybody do this well? How have you seen the transportation data shifting to not just the systems that are providing the transportation, whether it's infrastructure or operation, but the people who are getting the service and what their needs are? And that could be for Eric or for anybody. Thank you.
Well, can we start with an easier question? I think that is one of the very hardest questions to answer generally, and I don't know how much data and standards can help answer that from a policy standpoint. I do think that having data and standards can help evaluate the choice that is made by saying, okay, we have values that drive our decision-making process. We can inform ourselves, as you say, with some of the information that we have available. But if you want to make a decision between, well, are we looking at sheer ridership numbers? Are we looking at total number of minutes saved? Are we looking at GDP or regional economic numbers that might be boosted by people having access to jobs? Are we looking at healthcare measures that might be improved by better access to transportation? Are we looking at safety measures? I think historically, these are all the hardest questions anyway. I think data and standards have the potential to provide better answers to the question, how are we doing on the policy choices that we say are important to us? And maybe from there, it might be possible to think about how to use them more on the front end to help make those decisions. But historically, transportation has been a very sort of, okay, let's think about where we put our money. Let's think about where we make an investment. Let's think about where we make a choice. And it's pretty rare from a sort of a top-level funder perspective, a public sector funder perspective, to go back after you do a project and say, well, how did we do? Did we achieve our expectations? Did we exceed them? Did we go on the low side for some reason? because the whole system is not necessarily oriented that way. I mean, there are folks who do that kind of analysis because they're committed, because they want to know the answer. And as I say, I think data and standardized data can help to make that process easier. I would love to get to a point where we can say, okay, now that we are using data and standards to better understand what it's possible to measure, how we can define success, now we can incorporate some of that definition into the policy decisions at the front. But I think we're probably a little bit further away from that than some folks might like, including me.
Thanks. Other folks? Brian Housel, any?
Yeah, I guess there was something in the question that sort of maybe, I guess, tripped a flag for me, where it's just I think that the question was about using tools to better connect to the users and better, I guess, measure the impact of some of these development projects. I've worked at a few places now where we kind of almost go out of our way to not track users. And I just say that if this is being done, you kind of have to be aware of people's privacy concerns there. Because this is a thing that comes up sometimes when in discussions about tooling. It's like, oh, we could find out where our users are going and what they're doing, and if this matters to them. And not everybody necessarily wants that. You have to do data collection in ethical ways. So maybe that's just the only thing that I had to add, is that there's some caveats there.
Thanks. Other folks in the audience?
I wonder if you can talk more about connectivity in general. I first taught myself how to use transit 10 years ago using Google Maps. All the modes of transportation in Seattle I learned about from Google just telling me to get on the light rail or the sounder, and now I use One Bus Away mainly because I already know, where the local bus stops are. But I think connectivity between modes of transportation is so important for mobility in general. And talking about standardization, I wonder how something like that is managed, or if you have any thoughts about that.
I'd say the ecosystem of applications has gotten richer in the last 10 years. I think many apps, including Google Maps, are still kind of unimodal in that it's hard to get truly mixed integrated routing results. There are plenty of folks, Google has some of that, but there's plenty of folks who are doing even more aggressive, trying to combine modes in different ways. And I think, that is a reflection of a user need, but also the opportunity to integrate data sources that, you're lucky to get just the one thing, whether it be just the transit data, or you might have a focus on pedestrian accessibility. It's finally getting to the point where the data is, I don't want to say commoditized, but the cost of acquiring the data you need to build a true integrated thing is cheap enough that you can make that happen. You can start to really explore that. There's still moats in this space, whether it be on the rideshare side or other places, or where there's a gap on the map. But I think as the data access has gotten cheaper, it's made it easier to build those sort of integrated applications. And I think we've just seen a flourishing in that space of different options there. And like I said, it doesn't have to be Google Maps. There's plenty of other good applications out there that can do some of this stuff in more specialized ways.
Other folks? Or, actually online here, do you want to comment on that, or maybe we can slip in one more question if not?
I might just add really quickly that when we talk about connectivity, it isn't just a mapping or information problem. The fact is that you have so many different transportation systems with human, shall we say, non-connections, because they're all owned and operated, and information is created about them by different people, different organizations. And one of the great promises of having the kinds of data standards we're talking about is that you can use a platform like Google Maps to create a way of navigating all of these systems using a common language without having to depend on the information that is being generated by someone who's only running one piece of it, right? I don't know that we can completely overcome, again, what is a problem of human limitations unless we acknowledge that, oh, well, connectivity is more than just about the mechanics and the tech. We need to make sure that we have a way of speaking the same language if all of these different groups are going to be involved. I mean, think about all the different transit operators just in the Seattle area. And where would you go to each of those places to get a comprehensive map? You can't. You need to use one of these platforms. You need to use one of these new things that are proliferating to get that comprehensive picture, because it's not going to be provided by a single operator.
That's great. We have about 1 minute left. Is there just a final parting shot? Maybe Anat's got the mic in her hand, so maybe that's...
Yeah, hi. I'm so excited about this panel, I have to say. So I am very thankful that you agreed to come on. What do you see then as this solution? We don't have a government that will implement something like a mobility as a service from above, and that's possibly the right way to go. We don't have the forces from below to create an intermodal system that is interoperable and standardized. What is the path forward from each of you?
Maybe I'll jump on that one real quick. For better or worse, because it's crammed down my throat every day at work, ML AI, like it's coming, with all its biases, with all its flaws. But I think generally the proliferation of cheaper imagery, automated ML, sensor systems, we're going to be mapping more spaces in the world at scale at a cheaper cost than we have in the last decade or the last century, which is going to have a lot of issues. A lot of, it's going to be driven by corporate interests primarily, but I think it's going to get to the point where that data will become commoditized and it'll be accessible, and it will enable the sort of, I think the dream application I think we all want, which is you can walk out anywhere in the world with any set of affordances and have a real up-to-date map of like, how do you get from point A to point B? And I think it's our job as advocates to try to steer that ship the best we can. But I do think that's the direction we're headed.
Brian Housel?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with other Brian. It just seems like at the rate that things are advancing with tech, a lot of the problems that we're seeing today, I'd like to hope are going away. Problems of scale, problems of data quality, problems of data freshness. All of these are things that are I'd like to see go away over time.
Eric?
I'll just remind my Brian friends that there are also plenty of Erics in transportation. So I also, who's the other Eric and how does this work? It's not something unique to you. But I will say that I think that the question shows the importance of having some kind of middle ground between too many folks are involved. It's too hard to wrangle everyone just at the local level or all the private sector folks by themselves. And then we're not necessarily looking for a top-down solution driven by, let's say, the government in Washington. I think it's more important than ever to think about how we can work on open development with a community approach that can involve all those different folks and come up with something that works and is adopted widely, because initial successes beget further successes, the GTFS development model. And I think that a couple of years ago, when the Federal Transit Administration basically endorsed GTFS and now requires transit agencies to use GTFS in doing their statutorily required reporting to the National Transit Database, it's the first time I can think of, and I was with the US government for more than 20 years myself at DOT, I can't think of another time that the US government ever said, it looks like there's a de facto standard that has emerged in an industry. We didn't develop it. We weren't even really part of it. We didn't fund it. But now we're going to require it because we've noticed that it's become the de facto standard. And that approach is one that we endorse rather than having to be the ones ourselves to do it. So if they can do that for transit data, I think it shows the potential that we have to export that to other kinds of transportation data standards too.
Okay, we are at 3:03, so I think we'll call it there. Thank you so much to the panelists. This is a fantastic group of people that have done really influential work, and for everybody in the room, and really quite far beyond that. So let's give a round of applause to folks for speaking.